Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Linda Maisels, and I'm the Managing Director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, and I want to welcome you to today's program. Pavel Brunssen is with us today, and he'll be speaking about his newly published book, The Making of Jew Clubs, Performing Jewishness and Antisemitism in European Football and Fan Cultures. Now, before I introduce our speaker, which I'll do in a moment, I have three quick announcements. First of all, YIPSA has pledged to purchase a copy of Pavel's book for any interested Yale undergraduates who are attending this event. So I'm sorry, that doesn't mean that you can get a free book for your granddaughter or for your friend who's not on the webinar. But if you're a Yale undergraduate and you'd like a copy of the book, please contact me after the event and we will make sure that you get a copy. I want to let you know that we will have time for questions at the end of Pavel's talk. The chat function is disabled, so if you have a question, please submit anything that you want to ask under the Q&A function, and you can do that as the webinar goes on. I also wanted to give a quick shout out that our next program will be an in-person event. On October 6th, Professor Leora Bilski will be giving a lecture entitled The Beautiful Crime, Raphael Lemkin, the Schwarzbard Trial, and the Double Life of Genocide. There are more details about the event on the IPSA website, and we hope you will join us. So having gotten that business out of the way, I want to welcome our speaker, Pavel Brunssen. Pavel, are you with us?
Yes,
Hi.
hello, good afternoon.
So good to see you. A quick introduction. Pavel Brunssen is a research associate and Alfred Landecker lecturer at the Research Center on Anti-Gypsism at Heidelberg University. His research interests include anti-Semitism, anti-Gypsism, memory cultures, European soccer, and fan cultures. He holds a PhD in German studies from the University of Michigan, where he received the Marshall Weinberg Prize for his dissertation on the making of Jew clubs, performing Jewishness and Antisemitism in European soccer and fan cultures. Also, I would be remiss if I did not mention that Pavel was a visiting research assistant here at the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism 9 years ago. And Pavel, I believe that's almost to the day. Is that correct? Great. So it's so nice to have you here with us. And at this point, I want to turn this over to you to start your presentation.
Thank you so much, Linda. Let me share my screen. Good afternoon or good evening from Germany. Yeah, it's great to be with you again after 9 years. Linda, thank you so much. And thanks to Inessa Leskova and Maurice Samuels. And yeah, it's great to be here again and present the book which just came out. So as we begin the presentation of the book, imagine walking into a football stadium in London. In the football stadium, you hear chants, Yid Army, Yid Army. And in this context, you have thousands of mostly non-Jewish fans who are shouting the word Yid. The term Yid, a term distinct from the term Jew or the Yiddish Yid, this word has a long history as a slur. In this stadium, however, the fans use it in a very particular way, as an expression of identity and in support of their football team. So what is happening here? Why are mostly non-Jewish supporters embracing an identity they do not inhabit? This paradox was the initial irritation that led me to write the book, The Making of Jew Clubs. Why have certain football clubs become known as Jew clubs, even when their Jewish connections are not stronger than of most other football clubs? The answer to this question matters because football is Europe's most popular culture. Stadiums are spaces where anti-Semitism and performative Jewishness intersect in complex ways. And they are spaces where European societies negotiate their relationship to the Holocaust and the lessons they draw from it. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I will share some key examples and some of the main concepts of the book that show why these clubs matter, not only for football, but for how we engage with the history of the Holocaust today. So what exactly is a Jew club? Is it a club with mostly Jewish players or fans? It is not. Does it celebrate Jewish holidays or use Jewish symbols? It does not. So unlike explicitly Jewish clubs such as Maccabi or Hakoach, Jew clubs are not Jewish in a literal sense. So I always write Jew clubs in quotation marks to mark that this is a contested concept. A club is a Jew club because fans, history, and collective memory actively produce an identity that associates the club with Jewishness. Jew club is an identity that is shaped by history, kept alive in collective memory, and that is performed in the present, but is not defined by who is actually Jewish. Let's look at the 4 clubs I explore in my book, because each case highlights something different about this phenomenon. In this book, I explore 4 football clubs labeled as Jew clubs. Each case study reveals the different dimensions of how memory cultures, anti-Semitism, and Jewishness are performed and contested. The first chapter examines FC Bayern Munich from Germany. It shows how the club became marked as a Jew club and how this label has become an identity grounded in memory culture, a memory culture that centers around the club's former Jewish president, Kurt Landauer, here honored by the fans in the stadium. The second chapter is about FK Austria Vienna from Austria. The club was associated predominantly in the early 20th century with trades and spaces, people connected to Judaism, such as modernity, cosmopolitanism, the city, and the coffee house culture. In the third chapter, I focus on Ajax Amsterdam. Here, the Jew club identity is actively performed as a fan cultural practice. Football supporters started to call themselves Super Joden, the Super Jews, in response to anti-Semitic slurs from rival fan groups. The fourth chapter examines Tottenham Hotspur in London, in the UK. This case highlights how the Jew club identity was taken on by fans, again in response to anti-Semitism by rival fan groups. The identity is important in public debates around anti-Semitism and Jewish identities. At the same time, the Jew club identity also creates a space where Jewish fans can exercise and experience agency and solidarity. So one of the central takeaways from my book is that the so-called Jew clubs are not simply about football. Football stadiums, in other words, are not just sporting arenas, they are cultural and historical arenas as well. Let me illustrate this with the example of Tottenham Hotspur. In 1970s England, football stadiums were often violent spaces and racist abuse was common and unchecked. Tottenham, or Spurs as they are called, stood out because the insults against them were anti-Semitic and included the term Yid. Rival fans shouted quite openly that Hitler should gas them again. Here, them meant Tottenham. In the late 1970s, Spurs supporters reacted in an astonishing and quite irritating way. They began calling themselves the Yid Army, and they wore the label Jew Club as a badge of honor and pride. In the last 10 to 15 years, the situation changed. In the context of new anti-racism initiatives and cultural sensitivities, think, for instance, of the Taking a Knee initiatives or the renaming of sport clubs such as the former Washington Redskins, the fans' Yid Army identity became increasingly criticized. From now on, Yid was often referred to as the Y word, and its use by Tottenham fans became increasingly controversial. In 2013, there were even arrests of Tottenham fans who used the term in the context of football. But many Tottenham fans reacted to the attempts to silence their identity by embracing it even stronger, and they created a new song. And this new song went like this. We sang it in France, we sang it in Spain, we sing in the sun, we sing in the rain. They've tried to stop us and see what it did. The thing I love most is being a Yid. So in this song, a certain rebelliousness against authorities shared by many football fans in Europe played out, but it was also a reaction to the feeling of being misunderstood and to the imprisonment, to the arrest of the 3 Tottenham supporters. I remember during my research, I was speaking to one Jewish Spurs fan. He told me about the 1970s. He recalled the shock of hearing rival fans hiss in order to imitate the sound of Nazi gas chambers whenever Tottenham players entered the pitch of a football field. But he also remembered the solidarity he felt when thousands of Spurs supporters chanted back to the anti-Semitic slurs, Yid Army. For this fan, there were only three places where he truly felt safe as a Jew: at home, in the synagogue, and in the stadium when surrounded by Spurs fans. So football is a specific societal arena. Sometimes anti-Semitic abuse is observable in the stadium in overt and quite blatant forms rarely seen elsewhere. At the same time, however, the stadium situation offers fan collectives the opportunity to respond directly. Today, the meaning of Tottenham's Jew club identity is contested. Some see it as part of a vicious circle of rivalry that fuels anti-Semitism, while others still perceive it as solidarity with Jews. And for some, it has become little more than a nickname for the club. What this shows us is that the Jew club phenomenon is not just football. It is a window through which we gain insight on how societies negotiate their relationship to memory, to Jewishness, and to the Holocaust. So how do we understand what is going on here? Are these Jew club performances anti-Semitic? Are they philo-Semitic? I believe that container categories like anti-Semitism alone may be too limiting or too simplifying to fully grasp what is playing out here in these stadiums. To capture what is happening, I use a concept I call the Jew imaginary framework, a way to understand the ideas and emotions people have about Jews and how anti-Semitism, philo-Semitism, memory, and identity connect. But rather than discussing the concept abstractly, let us first look at a concrete example from Ajax Amsterdam fans. They have a chant and it goes like this: where do Jews come from? Israel from far away. Do super Jews live there too? Yes, super Jews live there. Do Jews like football? As long as they support Ajax, Amsterdam, Amsterdam, Amsterdam. The chant is structured as a dialogue, first between two halves of the stadium, then everyone joins in, Amsterdam, Amsterdam, Amsterdam. This chant exemplifies the Jew imaginary framework in action and allows us to understand the Jew club phenomenon analytically through the concept's key elements: Jew, imaginary, and framework. By calling themselves Superjoden, fans identify with the imagined Jew while at the same time constructing the Jew as an abstract other. So the chant externalizes Jews into history and geography. Where do they come from? The chant evokes the figure of Jew as something from the distant past. At the same time, the fans are projecting Jews far away to Israel. Ultimately, Amsterdam, Amsterdam, Amsterdam relates to the Jewish history of the city and brings the whole debate and context right here into the immediate local present. By imaginary, I mean the collective images through which societies imagine Jews, always as representatives of a collective, never just as individuals. The imaginary is a realm in which these ideas emerge, where they circulate, and where they are negotiated. The imaginary always operates within a social and historical framework. At the same time, framework points to the fact that the Jew imaginary framework is surrounding Jews like the quotation marks are put around the word Jew here. So the ideas about them have consequences for Jewish individuals, but they do not determine Jewish experiences. In sum, the Jew imaginary framework is a concept that forms the basis of and the connection between anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism. It shows how Jew clubs serve as platforms for negotiating Jewish experiences, ideas about Jews, as well as memory cultures and collective identities more broadly. What is the possessionality of Jews in the context of Ajax and Tottenham fans chanting Yid and Joden? Something they have started in response to anti-Semitic chants against them. A single chant, such as Yid Army, has different meanings to different individuals. For some, it is a form of hate speech. For others, it is a source of pride. Take the story of Jewish Spurs fan Daniel, written down in a blog post. Daniel had long wanted to travel to Germany to explore his family's history during Nazism. Finally, in 2021, when Spurs played a Champions League match in Leipzig, Daniel and his mother made the trip. They toured the memorial sites. At the end of their tour in Leipzig Stadium, he and her mother shouted Yid Army in the German football context. Daniel described the zeal in the eyes of his mother, a zeal he had never seen before. On this day, for Daniel and his mother, this was a chant about survival, pride, and Jewish presence in the very country where his family had once been persecuted. How do we understand such moments conceptually? Many academics use a concept they call linguistic reclamation to describe a process in which a targeted group takes back a slur and changes the word's meaning. Examples are terms such as queer, gay, or the N-word. But in the case of Ajax and Tottenham, most of the fans chanting Yid or Joden were not Jewish at all. They adopted the slur in response to anti-Semitic insults without ever identifying as Jewish themselves. Think of the situation as a triangle. First, the directing group, rival fans using the slur. Second, the receiving group, Ajax or Spurs fans appropriating the slur. Third, the targeted group, Jews, who may belong to the attacking or the defending group, or who are not part of either the directing or the receiving group. This triangle shows a paradox. Jews are affected but are often placed in a bystander position, witnessing how their identity is appropriated and attacked at the same time. The appropriation here is non-linear. Usually linguistic reclamation happens in a linear way, straightforward. A slur is offensive. The targeted group reclaims it. The meaning changes, and the word becomes socially acceptable over time or not. This is different in the cases of gay or queer, where the terms are acceptable to wider society again, or the N-word, where it's kind of an insider term, and we refer to it as the N-word, so it's not extended to the outgroup again. So here, the usual concept of linguistic reclamation does not fit. The fans' appropriation works differently. It is non-linear. Rival fans use anti-Semitic slurs to target the fans of the Jew clubs. Fans adopt the terms as their identity, thereby dissociating them from the anti-Semitism of rival fans. They take the words Joden or Yid and use them as symbols of their own identity. The words thereby are filled with new meanings, but whether this actually changes the meaning of the word is at least contested. And finally, for some Jewish people, most prominently perhaps the English comedian and Chelsea fan David Baddiel, author of Jews Don't Count, dissociate from the fans' use of the term. They, along with other voices, perceive it as always offensive. So the argument is the Y word is always offensive. It should not be used at all. So ultimately, the meaning change is double. Joden or Yid underwent both value switching. For instance, from the perspective of Jew club fans, the meaning changed. But at the same time, they also underwent value reinforcement, for instance, from the perspective of voices like David Baddiel, who say it's even worse now after they started using the term Yid. So in short, this is not, what we see here is not linguistic reclamation, but what I call linguistic appropriation. The meaning is changed only partially. And the appropriation happens in the constraints of the Jew imaginary framework, a framework that thereby is both reinforced but also transformed by these performative actions. Let us turn to Bayern Munich, to Germany, and to the figure around which the club built its Jew club identity, Kurt Landauer. Kurt Landauer led Bayern Munich to its first championship in 1932. Bayern's president was forced into exile under Nazism, but he returned to Munich in 1947, where he became the club's president again. Today, fans of Bayern Munich see Landauer as a symbol of their identity. In the early 2000s, it was not the club leadership, but the fans, especially the left-leaning ultra fans of the Schickeria, they established Landauer on Munich's memorial landscape. They published fanzines where they wrote about Landauer. They organized an annual football tournament named after Kurt Landauer. And they proudly created Bayern's reputation as a so-called Jew club. So here we see this cover of their fanzine where they have this image of Kurt Landauer, and they talk about the Star of David and the red shorts of the club. And then they merge kind of the old symbol of the club together with the Star of David. And here they talk about Kurt Landauer and the history of success of the Jew club, Bayern Munich. And they were one of the first to use the term in the context of FC Bayern. Only after the memory of Landauer was already established did the club itself begin to partake in the Jew club identity and the commemoration of Landauer. The club made Landauer honorary president in 2013. A statue of Landauer now stands at the club's training ground. And the 2014 feature film brought his story to national attention. But the narrative created by fans and the club was deeply selective. In its museum, the club told the story of Bayern as a Jew club that was systematically discriminated against by the Nazis. This image, however, obscured what later historical research, which Bayern itself funded, showed, namely that the club was not a victim on the sidelines of Nazism. Instead, FC Bayern Munich was a Mitspieler, as the title of the book reveals, a teammate, someone who plays along, who takes part. It was the club itself, although later than other clubs, that had implemented the so-called Aryan paragraph that expelled its Jewish members. Memory, in other words, had been a strategy of forgetting. Landauer had survived an exile. He returned to Munich in 1947. Here's his return displayed in a scene from the Landauer feature film. His return to Munich is today remembered as a symbol of reconciliation between Jews and Germans. But this memory actively suppresses the reality of the country in which Landauer returned. A country, a nation, in which Jewish suffering was denied and anti-Semitism persisted. This context forced many Jews to remain silent about their experiences. Remarkably, Landauer himself suggested to draw a line under the Nazi past, and it was under his leadership that the club reintegrated both former Nazi party members and the few returning Jews into the same club. These experiences and complexities are not part of the Jew club narrative. Memory is also a form of forgetting. This brings us to wider debates on post-Holocaust memory. Hannah Arendt, who visited Germany just 2 years after Landauer's return, described in a report how the Germans were busily stumbling through the ruins of 1,000 years of their own history. She observed their inability to mourn, and she reflected on the Holocaust as an abyss that humanity cannot reconcile with. Dandina later deepened these thoughts when he analyzed the relationship between Germans and Jews after the Holocaust as a negative symbiosis, an unconscious entanglement of guilt and trauma that has bound Germans and Jews since then. When I visited the practice facilities of FC Bayern in Munich, the Landauer statue made me think about the broader meaning of the Jew clubs and the insights of Hannah Arendt and Dandina. The statue of Landauer sits on a concrete bank that is shaped like a homestand or Fankurve, with Landauer inviting visitors to sit down next to him, so if Issi was sitting among the fans. The curved bank symbolizes FC Bayern's memory culture and Landauer's symbolic return. The bank furthermore consists of a crevice representing a break with civilization, the Holocaust. The right hand of Landauer stretches across the gap and calmly reaches over to the other side, thereby reconciling the past with the present. The monument paradoxically thematizes, yet rejects the consequences of Nazism. It presents the links between pre- and post-World War II Germany as one continuum. The crevice is small and the concrete is smooth on both sides of the abyss, as if the rupture had left no marks on what came after it. The tiny gap invites the spectator to see continuity between pre- and post-Nazi Germany. The monument invites its spectators to sit next to Landauer, either to his left, pre-1933, or to his right, post-1945. The abyss that symbolizes Nazism appears and disappears suddenly. Nothing before or after it suggests it had even been there. The abyss is buried under the statue and is thus inaccessible. Landauer, however, effortlessly reaches his hand to the other side. The monument rewrites one of the club's most significant Jews into Bayern's collective memory, while turning Landauer into a symbol of reconciliation, redemption, and continuity. Memory here commemorates, and at the same time it obscures. Hannah Arendt had still questioned whether we will ever get out of the abyss. It now seems as if the Germans have been busy constructing new monuments and buildings on top of it. This is not only the case in Germany. The busyness has turned into compulsive remembering, but it has also left the bottom of the crater intact. We have overbuilt, not overcome the past. So the Jew clubs show us that the past refuses closure. Ritualized commemorations create a polished memory culture, but beneath the surface, something unresolved remains. Anti-Semitism, silences, and unprocessed trauma. In football stadiums, this latent past erupts in chants, in identities appropriated and contested. So where does this leave us? Remember when I first told you about the Yid Army chants today? Throughout the presentation, I have made the case that the Jew Club performances are part of an ongoing struggle to come to terms with the Holocaust and the Nazi past. Football stadiums are arenas. In these spaces, post-Holocaust European societies engage with Jewish identities, memory cultures, and anti-Semitism. Take, for example, Spurs fan Daniel in Leipzig, standing with his mother and chanting alongside thousands of Tottenham supporters. In that moment, the stadium was not just a site of football, but a space where personal history, collective memory, and Jewish identity came together. I introduced the Jew imaginary framework because anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism alone do not fully explain the Jew clubs. Instead, they are deeply embedded in collective images about Jews and Jewishness. Through their performative practices, fans and clubs actively negotiate, reproduce, and contest these images. Who decides what Jewishness is and who gets to perform it? This tension plays out most vividly in the cases of Ajax and Tottenham. Here, in the process of linguistic appropriation, Jews find themselves in a paradoxical bystander position, a position from which they witness both the appropriation of their identity and the attacks against it. The case of FC Bayern shows that more memory culture is not an end in itself. Every act of remembering is also an act of forgetting. Every monument is also a smoothing of rough edges. Every attempt at reconciliation risks covering over what remains unresolved. So if there's one lesson I would like you to take away from this book, it is this. We need to keep working through the past, not working it off. The Jew clubs remind us that the abyss Arendt described and the negative symbiosis Dina analyzed still remain. They are still there, under the polished surfaces of memory culture and under the smooth concrete of Landauer's statue. Jew clubs show us that memory is never finished, identity is never fixed, and history is never just a thing of the past. Our task is not to smooth over the past, but to confront it with curiosity, with discomfort, and with care. Thank you.
Pavel, thank you so much for your presentation. I see that we have a couple of questions, but I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator, and I'm going to ask you one first. So one thing that came out in your book that I'm curious about is that part of this performative Jewishness that you talk about is also about rooting clubs locally. And it's also a confrontation with or a grappling with a Holocaust past. I don't know if you can quickly, with the 4 Jew clubs that you chose, and I know that there are other Jew clubs throughout Europe, can you give us sort of an overhead about what you found about that localism and grappling with the Holocaust?
Absolutely, thank you. So in the case of Ajax, where they brought in this Amsterdam at the end of the chant, the Jew club identity emerged in the late 1970s or in the 1970s in a point of time when there was a new Holocaust awareness. And in the book, I argue that this alone, or kind of this context, made possible that they took on the Jew club identity for themselves. It was not possible before. And this is for many reasons. One reason is that a new fan culture emerged called the Seiden, so a more organized fan culture, more playful in a certain way. And they, for instance, popularized nicknames for clubs that were tied to local spaces. Every club in the south of Amsterdam was called the Farmers, the Boeren. The clubs near the German border were the Krauts, and the Ajax was the Jews. And why were they called the Joden? Because people associated Ajax in a certain way with Amsterdam, a city that was still called among people from Amsterdam Mokum. Mokum is a Yiddish word, safe haven, space. And Ajax fans use it until today. I studied all these fans, and they always refer to Amsterdam as Mokum. They had banners with Mokum. So there's kind of this local identity in a city where most of the Dutch Jews lived until the Holocaust. And the club had a stadium until the 1930s in a largely Jewish neighborhood in East Amsterdam, proletarian Jewish neighborhood. So there was kind of a local connection between the club, the city, and its Jewish inhabitants. And in this context of new Holocaust awareness and also the changes of anti-Semitism, I know you discussed this last week as well, that kind of late 1960s, Six-Day War, and the change of perception of Israel. The moment kind of the Jew and Israel, people began to see them not only as victims, but also as villains, Six-Day War, as evil, as whatever they called them. It became attractive to the fans. So in a certain way, the rival fans who started the anti-Semitic abuse kind of broke through or kind of ignored or challenged or provoked the new Holocaust awareness and the taboo of the Holocaust. And the Ajax supporters responded by, well, this actually is part of our local kind of knowledge association with our city. And Israel is a villain, so we as kind of provocative fan culture, a little bit of hooliganism plays into it. Israel becomes something, it's not only kind of the weak victim anymore, but it's also the evil enemy figure. And so something that can be used to intensify the rivalry. And here you see how localism, local history, memory culture, and fan culture identity, I think, really come together, and the connection between memory culture and collective identity plays out.
Sorry about that. Thank you for that. I want to put a pin in this idea of Israel as villain, and I want to get to those questions in a moment, because I think obviously post October 7th we have some questions. But before we get to that, I want to take some of the questions out of our chat. So one guest asks, are there any parallel examples in which fans of one football club took over a slur by rival fans and made it into their motto? Hang on, this just moved. In other words, is this a more common phenomenon, or is this something that you see really with Jews?
Not in the same way. I mean, there are different, much smaller things happened. For instance, the fans of FC St. Pauli in Germany are called the Zecken, the Ticks. So this is a word used for left-leaning people or left-wing people. And the St. Pauli fans kind of took the kind of chants from rival fans and started to call themselves the Zecken in some of their chanting. But yeah, but it's more kind of connected to a political identity. And you don't have, for instance, I don't know, other minorities where you have a club identity of the Sinti and Roma, or I don't know, something like this. You have migrant clubs, but this is also tied to specific identity and history. So you have all different kinds of clubs, but I would say nothing like the Jew clubs, actually.
Thank you for that. I was actually trying to think if there were any parallels in American sports. I know that
Yeah,
certainly we have the contested when using, for instance, Native Americans as mascots, et cetera. And while you might have something like the Atlanta Braves tomahawk chop, which is controversial as well, I don't know that it is adopted to the extent that rival fans would then shout abuse about Native Americans, or have that makes such a collective identity. So it seems fairly unique.
yeah, and maybe I can jump in very quickly, because I think there's a significant difference that is important to understand also about European fan culture, where this Jew club identity most of the times comes more from below, so from the supporters. So in the cases of Ajax and Tottenham, it's really the fans, and the club leadership actually is opposed to it. So they try to make the fans stop. It's the case in Amsterdam and in London as well, where the clubs don't want to have this identity. And with these mascots, you usually have, you have a mascot, someone who's paid by the club to wear whatever, and they have official names, and they have a certain, I don't know, ritual or something that comes through the main screen in the stadium. So it's more top down instead of down top. It's not the base of fans or supporters that is doing it. With the exception of the Tomahawk Chop, with, I believe, in Kansas City, kind of the club dissociated completely from such an identity, and the fans still doing the sign and the ritual.
And your book brings that up beautifully with the four examples of when the fans are in alignment with or in opposition to club culture. One of the questions, someone was wondering if you can maybe speak more about Tottenham. According to your book, there's some lack of clarity as to where the identity of a Jew club came from.
Yeah, great question. The book is called The Making of Jew Clubs, and the question, where does it come from, always is part of the chapters. And interestingly, we cannot trace it back to an empirical core, like to say Tottenham had more Jews than Arsenal London or other clubs. This is not the case. So there's many factors playing in. With Tottenham, there are at least five. First, the area of the stadium, located next to one of the largest Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods probably in the world, where if you go on a game day with the bus to the stadium, you see a lot of Orthodox Jews, and kind of the story goes, this is why people associated the club and the stadium with the neighborhood and Judaism and Jews. And I think this is part of the explanation. Another part of the explanation is actually the Jews in the club. So for decades, Tottenham had Jewish chairman, Jewish leadership, few Jewish players, but still they have a certain amount of Jewish fans. It's not the majority, but it's a significant share among the supporters. But still, the Jew club identity was there before. And interestingly, around the, I think, 1960s, the club had two so-called super fans. So it was not only the leadership, but also from the fans. So two fans who were very close to the players and the clubs. They were called super fans because they were so close. And one of them was a person, if you wanted contact to a player, you would go to him. If you wanted a ticket, you could go to him. And he was known and he was Jewish. And there was a second person who introduced actually offering tickets for away games. He had a taxi business, and then he started another business which was offering bus tours or airplane travel to away games of Tottenham, and he was also Jewish. So certain people the club was associated with. And then the third reason is a TV show called Till Death Us Do Part, broadcasted in BBC Two, which was very famous, very successful. And the main character was an anti-hero. I think Alf Garnett was his name, and he was a supporter of the rival club of Tottenham. And he would sit at home with the scarf of this other football team, drinking beer, ranting around about politics and about the Yidds of Tottenham. So he kind of popularized the Yid identity of Tottenham as well. And then you had the fan culture of the 1960s to 1980s, with ties to the far right, to the National Front, a lot of racism, and also a lot of introducing new chants, new tunes, using, I don't know, something from the Beatles and changing the text to their own club and what they associated with their club and with rival clubs. So they were kind of a certain playfulness with identities in these songs, which I think also factored in. And then finally, in 1935, there was a game played at White Hart Lane, the Tottenham Hotspur football stadium, between England and Nazi Germany, the national teams. And Germany brought 10,000 fans to this game. This was state-sponsored to kind of show how well behaved the Germans are in a foreign country and how they support the national team and so on. And there was a lot of debate in Jewish newspapers at the time. Oh, they staged this Nazi game in the stadium of Tottenham, a stadium where many Jews were going to. And so Jews started to organize protests, and they protested with banners and so on outside of the stadium against Nazi Germany. And then there was one Tottenham fan in this game who went on the roof of the stadium during the halftime and took down a swastika flag, which was, they always had the flags of the teams who were playing up on the stadium, and he took it down. And this is something Tottenham fans still talk about today. And through this, we can also see how far back the identification with some Jewish fans with the club go, and that certain events already sparked debate, kind of decades ago, almost 100 years ago. Yeah.
So history is really present within these stadiums. It's fascinating.
Totally, yeah.
So here's a question from Ann Arbor for someone who says that they wish they had known you when you were in Ann Arbor. And the question, the individual is trying to place your work within theoretical work on anti-Semitism, or whatever label, however you want to label that. The Jewish imaginary, or the Jew imaginary, lines up well with David Nierenberg's work. And that's a question. Do you agree with that? Are you also in alignment with Bauman to the extent that some other terms, his is allosemitism, would be better than positing a continuum between anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism? So I don't know if you want to take all or part of that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I have a detailed discussion in the introduction that might be interesting, where I refer to Bauman and to some other scholars and concepts. And I think it's in a way similar to allosemitism, or kind of to the ways people create ideas about Jews. But here I wanted to have something that connects these four different case studies, because I didn't talk about Austria Vienna now, but really allosemitism also does not really do the job, because this idea of the Jew imaginary framework is in a way specific, that it brings together these different ideas of, okay, the Jew as other, the Jew as self, which is part of anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism, but is not limited to it. Then the imaginary as a realm in which these ideas circulate and created, and finally the framework, the concept, kind of the globe, what is surrounding it and where it takes place. And then within the Jew, I also make a strong argument for, well, the Jew is created as other, it's an imaginary figure, but at the same time, it has real effects on Jews, and the Jew is kind of in the quotation mark. So the Jew is surrounded by a certain framework, a certain set of ideas and practices in relationship to Jews that can be anti-Semitic, philo-Semitic, or whatever, but still has a certain relationship to a shared collective memory set or set of images and so on. So I also try to kind of do something in response to scholarship that said raised the form of criticism to anti-Semitism study approaches that say the Jew is a construct by anti-Semites. The Jew as seen by anti-Semites does not exist. And there were scholars who said, well, what we are doing here in anti-Semitism is we are writing Jews out of the question. There are Jews, and we have to leave them in the question. There's something cultural, something religious, something identities, whatever. There's something. And I wanted to kind of create a framework where I can really clearly say, here is a space for Jewish experiences and agencies within this framework, and this framework does not determine the experiences of Jewish fans, nor is it kind of something that, kind of says this is how Jews experiences. I hope this answers the question in one way or the other, and I think it makes sense to kind of read this concept next to scholars like Baumann and Nienberg, and greetings to Ann Arbor.
Thank you for that. And I think your answer, so you're talking about this, I know you talk about this triangular approach that really it's not just two groups, it's three, because the Jews, imaginary or real, are part of this equation. And that gets to I'm seeing more and more questions about the impact that this has on real Jews, first of all, and I know you've touched on some of that ambiguity. And one question that goes along with that, has Jew in this, in this context or in these contexts been appropriated as a metaphor for marginalization itself by fans who themselves might be socially and or economically marginalized?
So first, the impact is very different. So I have a whole discussion of the various perspectives on it in the Tottenham chapter. For instance, Jewish Spurs fans who discontinue to go to games because of the use of the Y word. They say this is a word that has been used as a slur. We know it from school. We know it from the history of fascism in Britain. The black shirts in the 1930s used it against Jews in an anti-Semitic way. And I don't want to hear it, and I don't want my children to experience this, and I'm not going to my club anymore because our fans are using it. Then there are fans like the one I mentioned in the talk, synagogue, stadium, at home. These are spaces where I can feel safe, I can express my identity, I can wear a kippah, I don't have fear of anti-Semitism. Impact, you already mentioned October 7. After October 7, there were Jewish fans coming together at game day in the Tottenham Stadium, saying Kaddish, the morning Jewish prayer of mourning about the people of who suffered and died on October 7 and the hostages. It's the only football stadium I heard this happen. I've not heard this from Israel or any other place in the world, but at Tottenham. And in terms of marginalization, that's a difficult one. Yes and no. Yes, in the way, for instance, where they express a certain identity in response to the arrests of the 3 Tottenham supporters. I don't know if marginalization is the right word, but kind of a response to repression, to something that happened to fellow fans, and they embrace the identity even more. There's one example from Ajax Amsterdam, where the police, where the fans were on a trip to an away game, and the police made them go into a train. So they didn't want to enter a certain train, but the police said, you have to enter this train. And one of the Ajax fans was shouting, wait, it's very typical that the police is forcing Jews into a train. So referring to the deportations of the Holocaust. And this, I think, is, here we also see the Jew imaginary framework really at play, because here kind of he refers to Jew as themselves and kind of as someone who experiences something that feels like, I don't know, injustice, unwanted, and at the same time compares this situation to the deportations, to the extermination and concentration camps, which again is a very irritating way to frame it nicely to evoke the memory of the Holocaust. And here again, we have local identity and memory culture at play in the football context.
Yeah, I think that brings up another question. You know, as you're talking about this deep identification in ways that can be sometimes endearing and sometimes quite offensive. Have you done any research, or has anyone done any research? And this is a question from one of our someone watching. What do fans of Jew clubs think about Jews when they're not at soccer matches or when they're not actively involved in that collective culture?
Yeah, I think that's a question that still needs to be engaged with. There are some examples I came across. And I think you will have diverse answers. You will have all kinds of responses to the question, I believe. There were situations where, for instance, Tottenham supporters greeted Orthodox Jews in the neighborhood of the stadium on the street and said something like, "Hey, fellow Yid," as a greeting. And Yid is usually a slur word. It's not used as a friendly greeting, not at all. It's different from Jew, and it's not a never neutral or whatever. It's always a term that has a certain meaning. And here, however, it was this friendly greeting to identify a Jew as a fellow Tottenham supporter and using the word and kind of flipping the normative. I don't know what is shouted at the street at an Orthodox Jew. Most of the time, probably is anti-Semitic or problematic, or I don't know, Jews who are recognizable as Jews experience the most anti-Semitism in the streets, and Orthodox Jews are main targets of this kind of day-to-day anti-Semitism as it plays out in the streets. But here you had someone who said, "Well, hey, hi, how are you?" Or I don't know, kind of friendly greeting, just because the person was a Tottenham supporter. On the other hand, there were rival fans of Ajax who kind of, in a way, attacked a Jew in the street wearing a kippah and said, "Well, you're an Amsterdam Ajax supporter and you don't belong in the streets of Rotterdam." Um, yeah.
So that's certainly a reaction of a rival club, not necessarily a Jew club, might be more
Yeah.
openly anti-Semitic. We only have about 5 minutes left, and there were several people who asked a variety of questions about the situation post October 7th, which obviously you had a conclusion, but you wrote the book really before October 7th. And I think people would like to know, certainly with changing population in Europe, with growing Muslim populations that are going to be fans of these Jew clubs. And also, you talked about Israel being a villain and how Israel has really been villainized, particularly in some liberal or leftist circles. What are we left with? What do you see the future of Jew clubs and how this plays out in a post-October 7th world?
Yeah, I wrote an afterword to the book because it was mainly written, the manuscript was written before October 7 to a large part. So I wrote an afterword, the Jew clubs after October 7. And I look at Ajax, for instance, where shortly after October 7, I believe for the very first time, there were some Palestinian flags in the fan section of Ajax. And those people who showed the Palestinian flags were attacked by other fans. So there's some rupture, some tension, some changes visible. There were Ajax supporters groups calling for leaving any national flags outside of the stadium. Don't bring any national flag to the stadium. For instance, before the Maccabi Tel Aviv game, where this violence erupted in the streets of Amsterdam. So you see less and less symbols of Israel in the Ajax stadium. This was already the case before October 7. So there is a decline in the Amsterdam stadium, which also has to do with new fan groups, very organized fan groups who, I don't know, have a very strong mentality to say this is about Ajax and Amsterdam, and we only want the colors of the club Ajax, or we want people dress in a way that fits hooliganism, so kind of staying under the radar and presenting the city. And the whole Jew club thing is a bit too, I don't know, playful, not serious enough for them, or so there is a decline. Tottenham Hotspur. I mentioned the Kaddish after October 7, which was unique. There was one pro-Palestinian demonstration outside of the stadium of the women's team of Tottenham Hotspur. But I'm actually not sure whether this was related to the Jew club identity of Tottenham or just kind of an incident or kind of random that it happened there. Bayern Munich, interestingly, in the last 25 years or so, it was mainly the fans who presented this Jew club identity after October 7. They, usually politically quite vocal, remained silent about October 7 and the Israeli war on Gaza and the whole situation. There was no banners or flags or statements, but the club itself was kind of vocal and made a statement, please go to a demonstration against anti-Semitism and in solidarity with Israel. They had the player who made this Instagram post after October 7, said something like victory to the resistance and this kind of, expressing solidarity with the attackers of October 7. And the club handled this in an interesting way, because other clubs who had similar problems in Germany discontinued the contracts with the player. So they released the player and said, you cannot play for the club anymore. Bayern Munich had a conversation with the player internally and said, well, he apologized and we had a good discussion about it. And he also had a meeting with the local Jewish community. So there were also conversations with Jews in Munich. And he continued to play for FC Bayern. And then Austria Vienna, is a different case. But in all cases, I would say the Jew club identity continues in one way or the other. So with Bayern Munich, it's also the case that the Jew club identity is kind of not up to date anymore, as we know from new historical research. But it's still circulating as kind of a club identity, and I think it will continue into the future as well.
So we're really at the end of our time, but I just want to ask you one more quick question that comes from the audience. What happens when two Jew clubs play each other?
Good question. I actually, there was actually something like a friendship between Ajax and Tottenham dating back, I think, to the 1990s. And I discussed the friendships of Ajax also in the book, because they have friendships also to other clubs that are not so much covered in the book. Cracovia in Poland, for instance, which are also known as Jew clubs in their countries. And Ajax kind of has this friendship, and Tottenham and Ajax fans visited each other and even created banners with the symbols of the two clubs and the Star of David on it, and celebrated their fellow Jew club identity.
Well, it's nice to know that the Jews are still taking care of each other, as to paraphrase. So I want to thank you, Pavel, so much for presenting to everyone that's joined this webinar. I hope you'll be able to get a copy of Pavel's book. It's terrific. And we hope we will see you again at future IPSA events. Thank you so much. And thank you, Pavel.
Thank you very much.